Welcome everybody. On behalf of the City of South Lyon, Wellhead Protection and Stormwater Management Planning Programs under the Public Works and Utilities Department, we welcome Mrs. Kelly Hahn. Ms. Kelly Hahn has over 19 years of experience in the water industry. Kelly received her bachelor's degree from Alma College in Political Science and Environmental Studies, and a master's degree in Public Administration and Public Policy from Michigan State University. Prior to joining Fleis VandenBrink Engineering in 2019, Kelly worked for the Michigan Rural Water Association as a training and source water protection specialist, and at the Michigan Department of Environmental Quality and the Michigan State University Institute of Water Research, administering the Michigan Wellhead Protection Grant Program and approving wellhead protection program plans. Currently, Kelly serves as a senior project manager with Fleis VandenBrink, and we're very happy to welcome you, Kelly. Thank you.
So, good afternoon. As she said, my name is Kelly Hahn, and I have the privilege of working with communities all over the state on source water protection and have for the majority of my career. So one of the things that I'm going to touch on today, well, I'll touch on a couple different topics, but starting with source water protection, which also you may hear me say wellhead protection, and then there's also surface water intake protection. So all three are kind of similar in that both surface water protection and wellhead protection encompass source water protection. So with that, I have had the privilege of working with the City of South Lyon for a number of years on source water protection. And what is source water protection or wellhead protection? So the source water protection program was developed out of the 1986 amendments to the Safe Drinking Water Act. And it is a voluntary program that's implemented at the local level, and then it also involves the county and regions and the state and various agencies, as you'll see throughout this presentation. And then guidelines for the program were developed by the Michigan Department of Environment, Great Lakes, and Energy, which was formerly the DEQ. So if you ever hear me say during this presentation Eagle, then that's what used to be DEQ. So there's a lot of different goals that communities will set for source water protection, but the primary goal is to protect the community's water supply system from contamination. And there's a number of ways that we look at doing that. So first of all, why do we need a program in place? Well, obviously the activities that are on the surface and the subsurface will impact groundwater quality. So here in the City of South Lyon, as many of you know, the source of drinking water comes from the ground. And so this graphic shows what it looks like underground, but also what types of contaminants you can have above the ground. So we have things like abandoned wells and landfills and septic tanks and pesticides, fertilizers, industrial use, all sorts of things. And the ground is like a sponge. So whatever we do on top of the ground will obviously impact the groundwater below. So here we have a groundwater model, and how many of you have seen this type of model? Has anyone? So the groundwater model is a wonderful tool. I actually oftentimes will use it in schools, and for the most part we focus on any and every grade level. So the wonderful thing about the groundwater model is you can do all sorts of cool things with it, from very basic things to very technical, detailed stuff that will remind me of my days of being in hydrogeology when I hated it. And so I try not to get into a lot of those real specific things that you can also do with this model, but they're great for all ages. So what we oftentimes will talk about is the water cycle, right? The fact that water is a continuously moving circle, and the same water that we were drinking thousands of years ago is the same water that we're drinking today. And the important thing about the water cycle is it's very slow. It moves very slowly, and it's obviously a necessary part of our life, right? And so then we hit the ground, of course, and this model kind of shows what it would look like if we were to go outside and start digging a hole. So first of all, we would eventually hit water. We call it the water table. And in this model, the water table kind of moves across here. And so the moment that we hit water, we call it the water table. And then based on the glaciers that moved through, we have all sorts of things like sands and gravels, and we call those unconfining layers because water can pass through them quickly and easily. So a lot of times when I'm in a classroom and talking to students, I'll talk with them about the fact, like imagining this whole room filled with bowling balls and then dumping water over top of the bowling balls. That's what it's like underground. A lot of people think that there's lakes and rivers that are actually under the ground, and that's where we pull our water from, and that's not the case. And then we also have things like clay, which are a confining layer and act as a nice barrier for water to not water, but contamination and other things to pass through it. And so in addition, there's things like wells. And of course, a lot of times we talk about the fact that there's public and private wells, of course. And so we have some shallower wells in this model, some deeper wells. There's also a septic system, so we can talk about septic systems and how those can impact groundwater quality. And the cool thing is you can contaminate the model. So a lot of times we'll talk about the types of potential and existing contamination sources that we have, and then trying to find one that we can contaminate. So you can adjust the flow of water to this model, which is great too, because then I can make it contaminate faster. So groundwater, the interesting thing about groundwater is that obviously it's slow moving, so it moves in a specific direction. And so this model will show you how contamination can move. So sometimes people will think, well, I have a contaminated site that's located near my well, and maybe my well is number 4. And so I have this contaminated site located right near my well, but depending on which way the groundwater is flowing will depend on whether their well will have issues. And so this model can be a great tool for all audiences. And it can also show how there's a linkage between groundwater and surface water and how watersheds look and such. And so this can be a great example of why we want to make sure that we're protecting everything that we put on the ground. So a lot of times the basic rule of thumb for me with any and all groups is whatever you put on the ground, it's like a sponge. It's going to go into the ground and it's going to eventually reach some type of water source. So that's why we have wellhead protection programs. So with the wellhead protection program, first of all, we identify the area that contributes groundwater to the public water supply wells. We identify the sources of contamination, and we also develop methods to manage those areas and minimize the threat to the public water supply system. So within Michigan, we have approximately 436 municipal systems that are using groundwater as their water source. And of those, we have approximately 209 that have been involved in some aspect in wellhead protection. And this number changes because the communities are required to update their plans that are submitted to the state, and I'll kind of go through what that looks like. But if they don't update plans within 6 years, then they become inactive. And so as of now, there's approximately 209 that have been doing something with source water protection. Now, about 50% of our state, it's a little more than that, is on surface water. So as the next map will show, so there's some areas in Michigan that don't have a lot of red, and a lot of those areas are primarily on surface water systems, and that's one of the reasons you don't see it. So we have 155 what we call approved programs, And that basically means that a community will put together a program plan, they'll submit that to the state, and they'll receive approval. And then we have 250 approved wellhead protection areas. So I'll talk more in the next couple of slides about what a wellhead protection area is for the city of South Lyon specifically. And then approximately 54% of the population that relies on groundwater has done something with wellhead protection. So what has the city of South Lyon done? So the city of South Lyon has been very impressive for a lot of years. So I started my career at the state approving plans and working with communities on outreach, and the city has really been doing source water protection since it started. So in 1998, the wellhead protection groundwater delineation report was completed by Hubble, Roth, and Clark. And then in March of 1998, the delineation report was approved. So I'll talk about what a delineation report is also in a second. It was hard to figure out, like, where do I want to kind of give you this bit of detail. So in March of 2011, the city worked with the Michigan Rural Water Association to put together what we call a wellhead protection program plan. And then again, in 2018, the city worked with MRWA to put together a second updated plan that was submitted to the EGLE, or DEQ. And today, the city maintains a very active program, this being one such example. So there's 7 elements to the program. The first of which is roles and responsibilities, and I'll go into more detail on each of these elements with all of you. So the first of which is roles and responsibilities, and then the wellhead protection area delineation, potential sources of contamination, wellhead protection area management, contingency planning, new wells, and public education and participation. So those are the 7 elements of what we would comprise and put together within a plan. So with a wellhead protection committee, there's always like the recommended types of people that you want to see. So we, of course, in purple have different types of city officials that might be on the wellhead protection program. We have environmental groups and teachers, the local health department, and then we also have maybe businesses or residents or farmers that are located within the wellhead protection area. And then finally, we will have others. Oftentimes, the wellhead protection area will extend into other municipalities, and so it's our hope to try to involve those other municipalities in the effort. So this is a list of the City of South Lyon's wellhead protection team, and it's comprised of a variety of different folks, and if I'm missing anyone, I greatly apologize, perhaps. But this is the list of members that volunteer their time to attend the meetings and to make this program the success that it is. So we have the city manager, the director of utilities and public works, the chief operator of water and wastewater, the water and wastewater operator, administrative assistant, the police and fire chief, an owner of a local business, a resident and retiree from Michigan Seamless Tube, and also the Michigan Seamless Tube engineer. And then we have a couple of other residents and a couple of consulting firms. So I talked about a delineation, a wellhead protection area. It's also called a 10-year time of travel. All of those things mean the same thing. So essentially, it's the surface area that overlies the aquifer that is directly contributing to the well, right? So the area is determined by pumping for 24 to 72 hours, how much water is available, and it determines the speed at which the water is moving. And the groundwater flow direction in the area is determined, and then finally data is gathered, it's put into a computer modeling program, and then that determines what your wellhead protection area will look like. So why is the wellhead protection area important? So at the edge of the area, it would take 10 years for contamination to reach the city's water supply wells. And so in this diagram, of course, at the edge of that red area, it would take 10 years. And so that's why we also call it a 10-year time of travel. So the state believed that 10 years provided a reasonable management area for any type of response to an environmental situation, and then it also provided an area that was not easy, but relatively easy to manage. So in these different photos, you'll see that there's all types of wellhead protection areas. Some are really large, some are very small. Some communities have several depending on how many wells they have, and all of these areas are very, very important to the wells themselves. So this is the City of South Lyon's wellhead protection area, and as you can see, it's rather large, and it kind of covers several different types of uses. So the city operates 3 primary production wells and 2 emergency backup wells, and they use chlorine, fluoride, and orthophosphate as treatment. And the water supply source is comprised of unconsolidated glacial deposits that are approximately 270 feet deep, or thick, I should say. And they overlie bedrock. And these deposits are then underlain by the cold water shale of Mississippian age. So because the shale doesn't necessarily produce a great volume of water, and also because it's highly mineralized, the city actually uses their groundwater from that glacial deposit. So the Eagle, or the DEQ, they basically went out several years ago and they determined what the vulnerability was of all drinking water supply wells in the state. And they determined that based on the level of protection provided by the depth of the wells in South Lyon, along with that clay layer observed in the overlying glacial drift, that the wells were considered what they called leaky confined. So the next element of the program is the contaminant source inventory, and that's where we inventory potential and existing sources of contamination, and then we map the sites of concern. So there's a variety of different types of contaminants that we'll look at, things like Part 201 sites, leaking and underground storage tank sites. We look at hazardous waste generator sites, landfill sites, federal Superfund sites, groundwater discharge permit sites. We look at all sorts of sites that could potentially impact the water supply. So the CSI is very important because unfortunately businesses do not necessarily have to indicate where they have a contaminant release, and they also don't necessarily need to provide a status update. So a couple of years ago there was an issue in West Virginia, and they ended up having a business that contaminated, they had a leaking above ground storage tank. They were right near a stream, and downriver from this site was a water treatment plant that supplied a lot of residents with drinking water. And so the wonderful thing about something like a CSI is after that incident and after there was the contamination issue, the state didn't necessarily correspond with this business, which didn't necessarily correspond with the water plant. And what happened is they weren't even aware that this was an issue until an hour or so after this stuff had already entered the treatment facility, and they realized that it wasn't going to necessarily take care of the problem. So immediately, very quickly, like within a month, which is like speed lightning for the legislature, they ended up enacting that all community water supply systems be notified, that businesses notify them if there's any type of release. And they also required mandatory wellhead protection programs in their state. So the great thing about this program, if anything else, is that it really, if communities are doing the right things, then they're working to educate those potential or existing users, and they're also able to stay updated with the status of some of these contaminated sites. So in this age of things like PFAS and 1,4-dioxane or chlorine and other emerging contaminants, developing an inventory of the risks, understanding the risks, and updating the CSI is critical. So, gosh, this this has been a whirlwind of a year or a couple years for the drinking water industry with all of the issues with lead and copper, with all of the issues now with PFAS. And so it's an interesting time to be in this field. So with PFAS, my understanding is that the city had a PFAS forum a couple months ago or something. And so I wanted to just kind of provide an update on what's happened with PFAS. So PFAS is an interesting, new, emerging, I don't want to say new because it's been around for quite a while, but it's definitely something that we are now focusing on much more than we ever have in drinking water. So Michigan put together this Michigan PFAS Action Response Team called MPART. The neat thing is that MPART is, they're trying to make everything as known to the public as possible. So MPART has a website that you can go to. You can access any information on testing and all that kind of stuff, because I think that their hope is they want to make everything as known as they can based on what they felt like they didn't necessarily, were not as strong with keeping residents informed with everything with lead and copper. So this MPART team was comprised to address the threat of PFAS in Michigan, and they coordinated efforts with a variety of different state agencies. And so as you can see from this diagram, PFAS is kind of, we're trying to learn but how it all interacts within the environment. But it's pretty much in everything. Like, we all have some level of PFAS on us. It can be in dental floss, it's in Teflon pans, it's on any type of a lot of types of rain gear that you would wear, because it was basically created to withhold the environment. So it's very difficult to break down, and it's something that doesn't go away at all unless we take it out. And so this diagram basically shows that it can be in industry, and then it can end up going in from even a wastewater treatment plant. Once if it doesn't come out there, which they're finding that it doesn't, then it can end up in the waterways, and then it can be in biosolids and go into spread onto farms. And so there's all sorts of things with PFAS that we don't know necessarily yet. So the state wanted to take a very proactive approach, so they began testing all of the Type 1 public water supply systems in the state, along with schools that were on wells, tribes, child care facilities, and they determined that approximately 11% had some type of PFAS in their water. 3% had PFAS greater than 10 parts per trillion. So we're now at a stage where we can test at parts per trillion, which is a pretty incredible thing to be able to do. And so what it means is, we have more testing capabilities, but we really don't know necessarily what that means as far as how that impacts human health and such at this point. So, and then 0.1% had higher levels than 70 parts per trillion. So these are the existing PFAS sites in our state, and thankfully it wasn't as large as they initially worried about. They are finding that there's several sites of concern, but and it's still obviously something to be concerned about. But when testing that many water supply systems, it's a smaller percentage of water systems that are dealing with it. So they've been it's been in the legislature, and they are supposed to be providing a final draft this month on what the plan is. The standards should be here by late spring 2020. And this list just kind of shows you what types of defects we're finding with several of them. So PFAS is comprised of approximately 3,000 different types of compounds, and we know very little about those compounds. And so these are just a smidgen of some of the compounds that we have. So in Michigan right now, actually EPA standard is 70 parts per trillion. Several states have put in place MCLs, and I'm sure Michigan will have an MCL coming out here pretty darn soon. And in the meantime, you know, it's all over the board as to what some states are doing. Some have said 70, like the EPA standard. Others have went down to 35. Others are, so it's all across the board. We're also, I must say, in a new age too with PFAS in that, you know, years ago, the federal government would basically find a problem. They would research it, study it, then they'd pass it down to the state. The state would then look at that problem, and then they would basically look at it and research it and then come up with their rule and regulation and pass that down to the community. And PFAS is one of those things where it was discovered by, I mean, there were some issues with some Air Force bases and such in other places, but it was one of those things in the Grand Rapids area specifically where some local residents had discovered it. And so they were the ones that kind of brought it to the attention of the state. And so it kind of had a backwards approach, and that the local side of things determined it first, and then that led to action. So another aspect of the program is management strategies, looking at what types of land use are in your wellhead protection area and implementing management strategies based on those types of land use. So we have all sorts of land use types, right? We have more like industrial, agricultural, residential, commercial. While in South Lyon, the majority of the wellhead protection area lies within the city. And then there's also a small portion that extends out into Lyon Township. And land use within the city and township is primarily residential, so that's a great thing. And then there's also a small portion that's located in the industrial plaza. So this is just a timetable of some of the things that South Lyon has done with their management strategies. So they've looked at their current site plan review, and they've put in place groundwater protection measures. They've also put in place a groundwater protection ordinance. And basically the ordinance can be a nice tool to use if there's certain things that you'd like to see staying outside of a wellhead protection area, or if there's certain things that you'd like to manage within a wellhead protection area. The city has been doing a great job with stormwater management, and they have been looking at abandoned well management. So abandoned wells are located all over our state, right? Before we had public water supply systems, everyone had their own residential wells. And so the neat thing about an abandoned well program is communities can go through and inventory where these abandoned wells are located at, because they can be a direct conduit to the aquifer. And so they're really important to be plugged. And so that's something that the city has decided to have as an ongoing effort. And then in addition, the city has a mandatory connection ordinance. They also have been working with businesses and industry. They've looked at on-site wastewater in the past and household hazardous waste collection. And then two of the items that they've talked about more recently in the last update doing is incorporating wellhead protection into their zoning map, and also incorporating wellhead protection into their master plan. So another element of the program is planning for new wells. So if expansion of the water supply system is going to happen, then the community would look at how, where they would potentially locate new wells. They would look at how they would incorporate that into the wellhead protection program. They would also maybe identify a timetable of what that would look like. And then they would also look for potential new well locations. And that's something that I know the city has talked about in the past with the wellhead protection program, is where would we potentially locate new wells if we wanted to put new wells in. For efficiency, it's great to have all of our wells located in one area, but for safety and protection and emergency response, it can be a great thing to look elsewhere as well. So in addition, we have the contingency plan section, and basically what a community would do is review their current contingency plan and beef that up to include an alternative if they have some sort of spill, then what sorts of alternative supply would they have, and emergency water suppliers who would be bringing water to the city if needed, and then policies and procedures related to water supply replacement. So I work with communities all the time on this issue. I just had a community call me a couple weeks ago. They said, we just had a tanker that spilled. What do we do? And so they called me because they knew that we had worked through their wellhead protection program together and this whole section, and they were able to basically go right through. And because they had the police chief and the fire chief and others involved on their team, they were able to work right directly, very quickly together with them. And they all knew right from the get-go that it was in the wellhead protection area, which meant that it was even more important to deal with. And then finally, we have public education and outreach, which is so important. First of all, it can increase local support and awareness. It ensures the program's success and longevity. It lessens the likelihood of drinking water contamination through better managed water supply systems. And then it also better prepares and equips communities to deal with contamination in the event that there is a spill. So South Lyon has done a fantastic job of putting together a public education program. And so each year the city works to implement an aggressive program. The city has applied for and received grant funding for such efforts, and that's been fantastic. And there's some in the room that know far more and can go into far more detail about some of these public education initiatives and what has been done. So the city has went into the local schools, and they've done school presentations on drinking water protection and groundwater quality efforts. There has been water and wastewater tours, plant tours, and these have also been a really popular thing amongst a lot of communities throughout our state. There's a grant program that's available that helps pay for the cost of things like busing students to places, and it also covers the cost of materials and such that you want to give to students, or having a groundwater model set up there. It would pay for any of those types of things. The city has also done an annual creek cleanup, and they've involved the local scouts, and that's been a fantastic effort. And I know I have the details of how much has been collected, but it's a lot, and it's in my notes, which I can't see. But they've done a lot. One of the cool things is they've really worked hard. All of you, perhaps several of you, have worked really hard to collaborate with local school groups, or scout groups, excuse me. And so trying to find ways to incorporate scouts and other types of groups into the mix can be a great thing to do. Things like the city worked with the Eagle Scouts on a storm drain project. The Scouts worked to build signs for each of the 5 drains that are located throughout the city. The signs included a description of how each flows to the Huron River. And then the city has also worked with the Girl Scouts to label the storm drains. And so that's a really neat thing too. Almost every single school that I ever go into, I ask students where the storm drains go. And everyone, for the most part, thinks that they go to the wastewater plant. And so it's really, really important that we work to educate people that those storm drains typically, unless you're in a large city where they have some of it perhaps go to the wastewater treatment facility, the majority of communities, they go into the local waterways. And so trying to help people understand we do not want to dump things down those. We want to make sure that they don't get clogged. We want to make sure they're important, obviously, but just trying to make sure that we have an understanding of where those storm drains go and why they're important. The city has also had videos put together by some of these groups, things like a sewer tour, and I know they were working on a water plant tour at one point, and illicit discharges and such. So videos can be a really great thing, and a lot of teachers absolutely love things like this that they can use in their classroom that are part of the real world. So the city has also done collaboration at local events, such as the Touch Truck event at the local library. And I love this idea because you're basically taking local events that others have worked really hard sometimes to put together, and then you're incorporating a piece of a program into it so that both can really have an impact on that, and it can be a great thing. The city has purchased water paraphernalia that can be used at local events and also at things like the school presentations, and so that's also been a successful thing. Outreach materials that have been handed off, and there's actually quite a few outreach materials in the back if anyone is interested in taking a look at those. Newspaper articles, the city's placed drinking water protection information in the local newspaper and on their website, and all of those are great. And then at one point too, the city had put some information on the back of like the receipts too, which I thought was a really clever idea. I've not had any other communities do that, and I thought that was a neat thing to do. And so in 2011, the city received the Michigan Rural Water Association Exemplary Efforts in Environmental Protection Award. And these awards don't just go to any community in our state. So it's a really neat award, pretty large and beautiful with statue, or not statue, but piece of something. So source water protection does not dictate, but promotes partnerships. And it does not prohibit, but it promotes safe storage and handling of hazardous materials. So we understand that there has to be jobs, and there has to be industry, and there has to be all of these things that wastewater plants and farming, and we understand that all of these practices are here and have to stay. And so it's finding a way to educate people and help them understand what is in their areas and how they can best protect it. It does provide a management area that's approved by the state, a higher level of environmental review in the state permitting process. In fact, I am currently on a panel that is working with the NRCS, National Conservation Services, and I totally just messed up that name. But the NRCS is a group that deals with farmers and the farming community. And so I'm working with them along with MDARD and some of these others, Farm Bureau, and they are actually looking more specifically at source water protection areas because 10% of funding was placed in the Farm Bill for source water protection. So I think we're going to continue to see more efforts such as this where we're trying to work together and partner with others to try to promote and protect the program. And it also provides a plan for community growth, contaminant source inventories, new wells, and emergency response. So one of the things, especially in light of this whole recent thing with PFAS, looking at dumps, looking at contaminated sites, looking outside of the wellhead protection area even is so important is because we have these facilities and these sites that they have had issues, and so we need to find ways to proactively work to protect the source. And so I love this quote, an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure. Essentially, it's far better to deal with heading off a disaster before it happens than waiting until after it occurs to deal with it and then figure out how we're going to clean this stuff up and how we're going to get drinking water to a lot of people. And so it's really, really important that we take a look at programs such as this, that we not only take a look at it and have them approved for the bean count of having them approved, but so that we're actually implementing them and using them and making them active. So with that, that's all that I have. If anyone has any questions, I would be happy to answer any questions.
One of the things I've seen in water tests for municipalities is a lot of deuterium, dissolved deuterium in water. Do you know what kind of health effects that has?
I actually do not. I have not heard of. Did you say deuterium?
It's around 100. It's a constant. It's around 135 parts per million.
Okay.
Except in inflation. It's a leaden way it goes into the mitochondria that have cells and destroys it.
Okay.
It's a radioactive.
I will have to take a look at that.
But it's in, I don't know whether it's in the test, the source water or the outflow water of a municipality.
So I will have to take a look. I'll have to look at that. Other questions?
One of the maps you had up there showed the aquifer and overlaid by a map of the city. And I mean, is that accurately portrayed where the actual boundary is for the aquifer underneath the city itself?
Yes, so this map, basically what they do, as I mentioned, is they pump the wells for a certain amount of time, and they put all of the details into a computer modeling program that generates this map. So sometimes, obviously, the aquifer can be larger than the area, of course, but the whole premise behind that being that it would take the water approximately that long, 10 years, or they allow 5 year or 1 year for any type of issue to reach the public water supply.
Okay, so one of the challenges facing the city is the future need to perhaps tap into a separate aquifer or an additional water source. So the reason for the question is, obviously the southern boundary for that aquifer ends probably about, we still have another mile to the actual city boundary. And the question becomes, is there another aquifer within that mile that, maybe that could be tapped into eventually for a separate source?
Right. So that's a great question and a great point. So one of the things that we do, for example, at our firm is we work with communities on potential new well locations. So we can identify where there are potential spots to locate new wells, and based on the availability of drinking water and such, or groundwater, I should say. So we are able to work with communities and do work with communities on those sorts of things. But that's a need that a lot of communities have, right? Because we have to be within so many feet, of course, of potential source of contamination, and so there's these setback requirements, and then we also have to worry about the potential of water availability and such. So, but my recommendation always is to take a look at that. So the other thing that the state is now doing, which is fantastic, is they are really wanting communities to try to work with them before they put in place this new well. So that instead of putting in a new well and then finding out, oh shoot, it's located right near this spot that's a bad spot, they now would really like it if communities would work with them to determine the wellhead protection area prior to installing a new well.
And that makes good sense. The other thing that I'm looking at is from a financial standpoint, there's economic benefit if you can locate that well within the underneath the boundaries of the city where the infrastructure already exists.
Right.
From a piping standpoint, et cetera, over to the water plant for processing and the rest of it. So that's why I was just curious if that was relatively accurate. So forth. Thanks.
Sure. Yes. And actually, that's one of the things that a lot of communities, a lot of experts will say, you want to locate in one specific area for efficiency reasons and such. And so now we're actually taking a look at, where else can we potentially locate another well so that it's not necessarily in the same aquifer source. So, very good.
If you go forward, I think maybe 2 or 3, there's another map. It's not a satellite map, it's a street map. And it has, I think you had 2 or 3 icons. There were dots and there was some unusual icons. And I'm wondering if you could maybe extrapolate that.
So this is actually...
I'm wearing my glasses.
Yeah, so this is actually the city's contaminant source inventory. So some of these icons will show you, the little circles are hazardous waste generator sites. So those are not necessarily sites of concern or potential risks because they have a hazardous waste generator on site. There are Part 201 sites, leaking underground storage tank sites, and then underground storage tank sites primarily are those.
Oh,
So the circles
are underground storage.
So I believe, I don't have the actual legend here, obviously, but for the most part, when I put this together, the stars would be underground storage tanks.
Yeah.
And so then we also, of course, look at Part 201 sites, leaking underground storage tank sites. There's typically quite a few hazardous waste generator sites in a community. And then we also take a look, obviously, at things like Superfund sites and what am I trying to get at? Landfills. And landfills are the newest concern, obviously, because, and so our firm has also been working very extensively on landfills and PFAS at landfills, because the majority of communities had an unlined landfill at one time. And unfortunately, for a lot of communities, they own the unlined landfills. So that can be another potential liability and risk. I have one community that I'm working with right now where we determined, because they have a wellhead protection program in place, we determined that they had a site that had made PFAS and they had dumped in the unlined landfill that was located near their wellhead protection area. So it's not in their wellhead protection area, but now they're aware of it. They're working with the state to try to determine who is going to be required to pay or to clean up and who's going to pay and all that kind of thing. So it's an interesting.
Great. So my next question, is this map outdated? One of those stars where you say underground tank, that's an old oil company, and that tank was torn out probably 10, 20 years ago.
So right. So the state requires that we look at both active tanks and closed tanks. So we do a list of both active and closed. Even if they've been taken out, they still like them inventoried. And so in the contaminant source inventory within the city's wellhead plan, you'll be able to find where there's active tanks and where there's closed tanks. And then oftentimes we'll put any kind of information in those if there's information to get. So that the star could be closed underground storage tanks.
And developers required to do studies of the water supply in building new subdivisions?
So I'm not sure on the answer to that. I'm not a builder, so I mean I'm not positive. However, I don't believe so necessarily. Now, having said that, I know that in the permit requirements through the state, through DEQ or EGLE, they are, and this is where the environmental permits checklist becomes important. So if the community has an environmental permits checklist, that's one of the elements of the source water protection program that's really encouraged. Then they provide that to a new build, and they have to go through and get all of the permits that are required through the state before they can have the building permit issued. And I will say that in that permit checklist, there are areas where they have to identify if they're in the floodplain or if they're, what type of impact they'll have on the stormwater and such. And the neat thing is they're coming up with all sorts of new tools and techniques for stormwater management. And so, and it looks better, right? Because you can have a nice area where you can put in some neat plants and trees and such instead of just covering everything with pavement. So I do know that there's some of those sorts of things that go into a new build. The neat thing about the community and the reason we encourage that is because businesses are supposed to, new builds are supposed to have all of those permits done anyways. So it's basically the city, before the city is signing off, they're saying, make sure you get all this stuff done. So I don't know if that answered your question, but they're definitely more aware. So.
What about the contamination? Can you speak to that? It's spread a little bit.
Oh, sure. I'm not typically behind it, so I'm trying to remember. So yeah, so the cool thing with the contamination is, like in this model, obviously it has spread and it's moving slowly, but it'll eventually impact well number 7 and could end up impacting layer here, and so if it kind of veers its way around, there's a pump, of course, on the well, right? So if it's pumped up, then it could pump the contamination up into the well. So well number 8 could be impacted too. But someone, let's say that's a mile over here in well number 3, hears about this contaminated site, and so they assume that they're going to have contamination issues too, and that's not necessarily the case. It all depends on which way the groundwater is flowing. And so we love it if we can obviously have our wells located in a nice clay barrier, that clay layer. And so here we have this clay layer, and so that can be great. And then there's also a septic tank model here. And the nice thing about the septic tank being in here in this model is that it can show, especially people who have cottages and such, where they have failing septic systems. Septic systems are a huge issue in our state right now. Something that probably is hurting far more groundwater supply systems than any other type of contamination, because a lot of people have septic systems and don't even realize they have septic systems. And so we recommend that septic systems be pumped every 3 to 5 years and, of course, maintained. And so a lot of these, especially homes on the lake, are right next to the lake, of course, and then they have these septic systems, and once they fail, then all of that stuff goes into the lake where they previously bought the house in the first place for. And so these can be a really good education showing how that septic system will impact the lake very quickly. So, but yes, you can also see that the groundwater is moving in a specific direction and how it's moving.
The city of South Lyon has, within the city limits, the city owns the land, okay, where there were open dump sites years ago, some going back 100 years, because I sort of do history, okay? And one of them happens to be right next to the water treatment plant. But these were most all of these were filled in and discontinued before the age of plastics ever was a factor, okay? There was no such thing as bottles and plastic, okay? Does this kind of thing pose any kind of a risk in view of the fact that there are deposits of peat, big ones, okay, all over town, and developers don't have any obligation to test for that before they start building a house, and ribbons of white water sand at different levels, some 5.5 feet to 6 and 7 feet, and some down 12 to 16 feet. How does this interact with the potential of contamination with PFAS, okay, and some of these other more sophisticated contaminants?
So as I had mentioned earlier, so unlined dumps are a huge concern for the state. In fact, I'm letting all the communities that I'm working with know that the chances of them being looked at next, and I know I know a lot of them are tested, but there's all of these unlined dumps, and we're not quite sure what's necessarily in them, and you know how dangerous they could potentially be to our groundwater systems. So one of the things that we are doing when we're working with the community on the wellhead protection program is we're trying to have teams that have residents who have been here for considerable amounts of time, because the residents that know what was potentially located in those sites is huge. And so having that background knowledge and that history is essential, I think, first of all, in understanding it. And then also, so I'm not sure what these specific dumps might potentially have in them, so I'm not able to say necessarily how dangerous I think they could potentially be. But the reality is that there were all sorts of put in place that were unlined, that were just covered up, some of which are not covered up in some of the communities that I work with. And so trying to figure out how we're going to deal with those dumps and what we're going to do with that stuff, and whether they really are dangerous or not, what's in them that could potentially be a problem.
Thank you. I just alerted, there's no ordinance or requirement that the developers that are building a new subdivision from the high ground to the low ground in any end of town, they have to test their soils before, for a number of things, okay, before they can build a house. And frequently, once you open up that ribbon of peat and white water sand, whatever's in it's locked in for years. But when you open it up and put a basement in there, then it all drains in around that basement. They're supposed to line it with peat pebble and everything and put a pump in there, such and so forth. But there's no ordinance, as far as I know, or state law that requires them to test the soil before they start building a subdivision. Or possibly it's unstable ground. You know, that's all I'm saying.
Right, and a great point too. So, very good. Well, thank you all for bearing with me on this afternoon after lunch session.
Thank you, Kelly.